Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear participants of our today's event, and of course, good afternoon, dear friends on the other side of the screen. Greetings from Riga. My name is Evija Djatkoviča and I'm researcher at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and Riga Stradiņš University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all at our today's event devoted to the presentation, discussion and also reflection upon our latest study, which assesses how have we, the Baltic and Nordic neighbors of Belarus, responded to the crisis that unfolded in the country right after the presidential elections of 2020 so far, and what can we do more, and possibly what can we do more together, on the one hand to stop the brutality of the regime, the brutal crackdown, and of course on the other hand to help Belarusians in their effort to start a new page in the country's history. Well, and in this context, it is quite important to note that at least for us, the Balts, such aspirations are actually very well known, very familiar. As little as 30 years ago, our people were similarly ready to manifest on the street their intention to break away from the grip of the Soviet Union and to step on the pathway to independence, democracy and prosperity. But well, back then societal engagement was not an ultimate aspect of success. In the early 1990s, Western support was instrumental for democratization process. Well, and our Nordic countries, our Nordic neighbors played a key role in this. In the case of Belarus, it seems that the Western community is somewhat more hesitant or maybe incapable to offer some tangible support or maybe simply lacks political will to do so, which likely hampers success of Belarusian people. Well, but let me stop here for a moment and leave space for debating this at our discussion part. And now I would like to introduce two very special gentlemen for introductory remarks. And let me start with Mr. Stefan Eriksson, Director of the Nordic Council of Ministers Office here in Riga in Latvia, and also kind supporter of this project and great friend of Belarus. So Stefan, please, the floor is yours here in the studio.
Sveicināti, vitayu. Welcome to the Nordic Council of Ministers office in Riga. And a big thanks to Ria and in particular to Evia for suggesting this project to us. It should be said that foreign policy issues are maybe not the highest priority of our office. This subject seemed so interesting that it was really hard to resist this proposal. It can also have something to do with the fact that I have a personal history in Belarus. I spent 7 years there as Sweden's ambassador. My main takeaways from this report is that the Baltic and Nordic countries haven't been indifferent to what has happened in Belarus during the last half year. There have been taken actions, decisions, different in different countries, which can be explained, of course, by different things, by geographical proximity, by history, by culture. The main idea is, of course, not to rank who has done the most. I think, though, it's very helpful to reflect what we can do together to strengthen the impact. And I also believe that it is our duty here in the Nordic-Baltic region to react to what is happening in Belarus. As you are aware of, the Belarusian authorities' repressions are still continuing. We read still every day about people being arrested, journalists, artists, well, different people. I mean, I personally know a lot of people that have suffered during the last half year, and that some of them are still in prison. So I think it's crucial mainly that we just don't accept this happening. We should also, of course, be aware of that there is no sole step or sole action that would resolve the crisis, the situation that we have in Belarus. If there were, I think it would have been resolved already since long. And in the end, of course, the main burden and the main responsibility of what will happen in Belarus lies on the Belarusians themselves. Still, to me, Belarus is a Northern European country. We have a lot in common. Potentially, actually, I would say that Belarus even could be a part of a wider Nordic-Baltic region. And it is, as I've said, very important not to give in to the fatigue that sometimes we may feel. There are a lot of problems in our own countries. There are a lot of problems all over the world. Expectations from Belarusians on us may sometimes be unrealistic. But we also, I think, need to keep in mind and understand the desperation that many people in Belarus feel today. And the least we can do, I believe, is to show strong solidarity and never get used to the repression that we see in a neighboring country of ours. Long live Belarus. Живе Belarus.
Thank you, Stefan. And now I would like to give a virtual floor, or actually virtual microphone, to Mr. Andris Sprūds, Director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and Professor at Riga Stradiņš University. Please, Andris.
Thank you so much. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon and welcome everyone. I guess we are, of course, here to discuss diverse converging regional responses to the post-election developments in Belarus. What we see and what we experience in Belarus is a political crisis, it's a democratic aspirations, it's brutal violence, and it's autocratic power grab. But of course, we can also say that developments in Belarus have important implications for all of us, for the neighbors and for the region. And already, as Ambassador Stefan Eriksson was saying, I mean, events in Belarus have also touched upon hearts and minds of our own societies. There is a resonance of what's going on in our neighborhood within our own societies, within our own countries. In general, I think we can say that the crisis has undermined the hopes that we can engage with autocrats and gradually somehow turn them into the democrats. And of course, this publication deals primarily with initial Baltic and Nordic reactions, but certainly it implicitly and also explicitly raises even more fundamental questions. How we can deal, how we can proceed with repressive autocratic regimes in the neighborhood, and not only in the neighborhood, also beyond the neighborhood. So I would add that this is a very timely, very important comparative publication and event. Certainly, we are very happy to partner with the Nordic Council of Ministers office in Latvia. Many thanks personally to the Director Ambassador Stefan Eriksson for seeing this as an important, for seeing important also how in the region we respond, what are our diverse and in many regards also converging responses. We are also very grateful to a distinguished set of authors and distinguished set of speakers has joined us in the process and also today. So from my side and on behalf of the Institute, on behalf of the partners, I can wish a dynamic and insightful debate today. And certainly we should keep the issue of regional responses to fundamental challenges in our own neighborhood among societies which we also care about on our political and research agenda. So wishing a very dynamic and productive debate today. And back floor to you, Evia.
Okay, thank you very much, Andris and Stefan as well for your actually very relevant comments. And before we proceed, I think a few words about our today's agenda also are needed. So we'll start with a brief presentation of the main research outcomes, and then we will proceed with expert debate. And today, actually, we have gathered the full spectrum, let's say, of experts. We have academic representation, we have policymakers, and we have policy implementators. And let's hope that we will have also opposition of Belarus here with us today. And so in the discussion part, I kindly encourage our audience to pose questions to our distinguished guests. And for doing so, you should use a Slido application. And so you can see the entrance password, entrance key in your screen, in the corner of your screen. So great, it seems that also Franak has joined us. So indeed, we have representation of Belarusian opposition as well. So thank you for that. And at this point, I would like to introduce all our distinguished guests of today. And let me start one by one. So we have today Mr. Ramūnas Vilpišauskas, and he's Jean Monnet Chair Professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. And I should uncover that Ramūnas is also co-author of the study, and he covered chapter on Lithuania. So hello, Ramūnas. Then we have Mr. Hans Wallmark. And Hans, he's a Swedish parliamentarian, and he's actually recently former president of the Nordic Council, which is a parliamentarian dimension of the Nordic Cooperation Platform. And so he has been closely engaged in the Nordic-Baltic cooperation. Hello, Hans.
Hello.
Then we have Mr. Andrejs Viljamsons, representing Latvian side, Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's director of the first bilateral relations department, and he's a person directly and permanently working with bilateral relations of Latvia and Belarus. So thank you for joining. And last but not least, we have Mr. Franak Vyačorka, and he's senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of Belarusian opposition. And in many ways, I guess I can say that Franak has been engaged in a Belarusian opposition for a couple of years already. And maybe using this opportunity, I would like to promote his documentary, which I accidentally recently found on YouTube, called Lesson of Belarusian. And the movie, the documentary, illustrates events happening in Belarus during the presidential election 2006 and gives very personal insights on the brutality of the regime already back then. And actually, we can see many parallels with the situation, with the current situation. So that's my advice for later tonight or today evening. And gentlemen, already thank you very much for joining me today, and let's hope we have a great event together. And now, without further ado, I would like to proceed with a kind of presentation or a listing of main outcomes, main conclusions of our research that we are debating today. So this is what we found out. Let's start with the Baltic countries. It seems that the Baltic countries, Lithuania in particular, but also Latvia, as the most immediate neighbors to Belarus and also economically most engaged and therefore most independent with Belarus, can be fairly called sort of front runners or pace setters of Europe's collective response to the crisis, at least in the initial stage. So the Baltic countries kept the issue on the agenda of the leading international organizations, including the European Union, Council of Europe, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, where, by the way, Estonia currently holds position of non-permanent member of the Security Council. And of course, the Baltic countries demonstrated their resolve also by their own example. So national and also regional sanctions across 3 Baltic countries were imposed. So the Baltic countries jointly blacklisted more than 150 Belarusian officials. And actually just recently, very symbolically on March 25, the Freedom Day of Belarus, the Baltic countries announced one more round of sanctions, adding around 118 more officials to the list of persona non grata. And well, apart from this, many significant state-level projects were suspended or cancelled. For instance, Latvia withdrew from the initiative of the joint World Ice Hockey Championship with Belarus that had to be held actually in May, very soon. And also Latvia cancelled the electricity purchasing deal with the recently built Astravets nuclear power plant station. So all in all, even if more symbolic in their essence, those steps served for 2 purposes. On the one hand, for punishing Belarusian regime, but on the other hand, actually for pressuring further international engagement, and particularly the EU, as the consent making on sanctions was actually quite slow. So in this crisis, so far we could say that the Baltic countries punched above their weight. And then if we proceed with the Nordic countries, then what our research uncovered was that for most of the Nordic countries, Belarus was a country that barely existed prior to the crisis. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland are, of course, more distant and largely interact with Belarus through the international organizations and platforms formats. And there are not so many significant links, neither political nor economic or even societal in terms of tourism. And subsequently, those national responses were largely streamed via international formats. Where, of course, the Nordic countries have significant influence and impact. As regards the collective actions taken by the Nordic countries, so they increased support to the civil society and held consultations with Belarusian opposition. However, rhetoric remained their main foreign policy instrument throughout the initial phase of the Belarus crisis. So, and what we have concluded from all of this, first of all, it is pretty clear that geography and prior relationship intensity really matter when it comes to engagement in international crisis. And if we put it in other words, so if I'm a country in trouble, then it might be of crucial importance who are your neighbors or who are my neighbors, and how engaged, how bilaterally engaged we are, and how internationally influential are those neighbors to facilitate further international reactions. This is thing or point number one. Then if we proceed to point number two, it became clear that except from suspension of already sort of limited political dialogue or relations with the regime, and some negative implications of travel restrictions due to the COVID-19 on societal engagement and movement, there were no too many other implications, particularly on the Belarusian regime. So in particular, what really matters for the regime in crisis is economic interaction, right? And it seems that it has remained so far unchanged. Of course, I have to admit that there were certain limitations of statistical data availability, and maybe it's still too early assessed, but nevertheless, economic interaction remained. And thirdly, which is quite important conclusion as well, is that the study clearly depicted that even between two geographically close regions and 8 politically, ideologically close countries, perceptions and reactions to the Belarus crisis were actually quite different. There were countries that already from the very beginning of the crisis, there were strict and in favor of sanctioning policy against the regime, but then there were countries that were in favor of dialogue with the current Belarusian regime in the initial phase. And then there were other countries that engaged in the crisis and solution of the crisis rather out of solidarity with neighboring countries than out of genuine interest in what's happening in Belarus. So this would be in short from my side. Thank you. These have been observations and the research, and for more methodological details, and also for if you would like to see or read the full text, please check the policy brief, the research on the homepage of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. So, and finally, we have come to the part where we I would like to engage also our experts and to see what they have to say about already past steps and future prospects. Let me start with the first question, which I would like to ask actually to all of you. Let's do a round of answers. And it would be, I would be keen to hear your assessment of response of your country, of your region, and of Europe, and actually Western community at large to the Belarus crisis. So what measures were taken so far? How do you assess them? And let me start with the most immediate neighbors, and let us start probably with Lithuania, as Lithuania can be fairly called really a pace setter, hosting leaders of opposition, urging for sanctions, and doing much more. So Ramūnas, could you please comment, how do you see from your perspective what has been done so far on those 3 levels?
Hello, thank you, Evia, and I want to thank colleagues in Riga for leadership in this initiative, in undertaking this study, inviting me to contribute to it and also to participate in this discussion. My answer, which I have to limit to 3 minutes, will start from the end of the question. My assessment of European Union's response to what happened in Belarus. And I would say that the response of the EU represents what was possible, taking into account 3 factors. First, divergence of national priorities of European Union member states. Cyprus, of course, comes to our mind first here, with its initial foot dragging with respect to the introduction of sanctions, targeted sanctions by the whole of the EU to the officials of the regime in Belarus involved into fraud elections and violence against its citizens. The second factor, procedures and institutions which have their aim at forging a consensus among all EU actors, but it is a time-consuming exercise. And the third factor is the influences of other external actors. Of course, first of all, Russia comes to my mind here. So having in mind these three factors, I would say what took place in the last half a year or a bit more was what was possible to do. But what was possible on behalf of the EU does not equal what was desirable by some of its member states, first of all, Baltic states, and especially Lithuania. In Lithuania, reaction was quick. Well, first of all, there was an offer to mediate between opposition and ruling elites in Belarus. There was an offer to mediate between ruling elites in Belarus and the EU. There were various positive incentives offered. First, when it turned out that there is no dialogue, no meaningful dialogue in Minsk, then of course Lithuania turned to sanctions policy and parallel support to democratic activists, hosting them in Lithuania, providing facilitated entry, and so on. All these measures are described in the study, so I won't go into them. So Lithuania was indeed fast and comprehensive in its response, and it was trying to involve other regional neighbors, first of all, Latvia and Estonia, and Poland, often acting together with Poland, sometimes with some other EU member states, for example, Romania, sometimes together with Poland and Ukraine. So these, I would say, were the most important features of Lithuania's response, and often this turned into a regional response of all three Baltic states, or Baltic plus response, as I would call it. Was this sufficient? I don't think so. If we apply a standard of ideal, desirable response, no. But if we see how EU reacted, I think it was quite okay. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Ramonas. Yes, desirable and actual responses and things sometimes differ indeed. But now let's proceed with Mr. Andrzejs. It seems that Latvia has changed its stance vis-à-vis Belarus quite significantly, considering actually a decade of lively political and economic interaction. So how would you comment the responses from your perspective and possibly from the inside of the system, right?
Thank you. With pleasure. As indeed, as you said, I'm one of these persons who are permanently dealing with Belarus. I came to Riga from Brussels in September, kind of in the middle of the crisis, when I started in the Minsk, and since that, I think that 70% of my time, I'm responsible for a whole former Soviet space, but indeed, like 75% of my time, I have to deal with issues related to the Belarus, and it's very natural because it's important neighbor of ours, and as you said, there have been pretty intensive relations between the neighbors, and there have been ups and downs. If we go back before 2015, the relations were not the best and the perfect. I think the turning moment was Crimea and occupation of Crimea and the stabilization of Donbas. and afterwards the policies that Lukashenko implemented in a balanced way. We have to give, if we go back to their history, we have to give credit for what he did in 2015. In not siding with Russia, not recognizing occupation of Crimea, and helping to mediate with the Minsk talks. I think that was the moment when EU and US changed its policy towards Belarus. I think in that context should also Latvia's policy be seen since 2015. Obviously, the changing moment for our policies was fraudulent elections and most importantly, the violence against demonstrators. I was a few weeks ago in Moscow with consultations with our Russian partners, and we obviously discussed Belarus as one of the important questions. We are both neighbors and I'm both interested in stability. And obviously we were also urged our Russian partners to talk to the Belarusian civic society. But I think that to my surprise, it was surprise for the Russian colleagues that one date can change so much in one country's attitude. But indeed, I think this one date change was a game changer until these fraudulent elections and this violence. I think Lukashenko was very popular in Latvian society. You know, I come from a small town of Latvia. I think, you know, in general, he was very popular, but I think he lost this popularity and support in the Latvian society in one day or over the night. So obviously the government policy had to change. The government had to go along with public opinion in Latvia, and obviously that's a true explanation why our policies changed. And obviously the economic relationship with this country was important. The trade between neighbors is always important. Your neighbor is always one of your most important economic partner, be it Russia, be it Belarus, whoever is your neighbor, it's very important in your economic relationship. But I think that the turning moment was, and this moment, and governments recognized that, yes, trade is trade, economics are economics, but you cannot have a predictable and stable economic relationship with an actor who is not predictable and who is unstable and is being controlled by manipulative third power. So that was the moment.
But if you could briefly just summarize in one sentence, so how would you what's your assessment of taken measures? Are they sufficient? They're not? They were timely? Or just some brief comment about the essence, right? You provided us the historic background, which is valid and relevant. But
I think Raimundas was very much correct. I think we as EU, we did what we could do. In general, I would say that the reaction was fast and appropriate on political terms. There are nuances that we can talk about, but you know, sanctions, more stronger sanctions, I'm ready to go on this deeper. But I think in general, it was timely reaction, and the reaction that was possible, considering the limits that our Lithuanian colleague mentioned, and considering the role of Russia. Thank you.
Okay. So let me proceed with another question to my Baltic colleagues before we go ahead with the rest of participants. Anja has already touched upon the underlying motives of the, let's say, turning of relations with Belarus. You mentioned public opinion that has shifted. But what about the, let's say, values underlying the response? Let me put it a bit differently and provide a bit of context. So, well, all in all, it seems that Lithuania and Latvia were actually very active if compared to other regions and other players in Belarus crisis. And seemingly, those countries pursued values-based foreign policy, which is not necessarily directly linked to the public opinion, right? And especially those two countries had to think probably twice before sanctioning or blacklisting Belarusian officials, because there's always possibility of retaliation, especially when you have some economic engagement, and there was a possibility of retaliation, for instance, in transit area, right? So on that side, it seems that, okay, we did a great job, that we really initiated sanctions and kind of pursued, well, we put values on the first line. But on the other hand, let's be frank, those sanctions were more symbolic than painful. And I really doubt that Mr. Lukashenko even noticed that he's now banned from entering Riga for another glass of, I don't know, Riga balsam, or having zeppelins in Vilnius for dinner. So what really matters was economic interaction. But somehow it was not really included in the sanctions. So economic realm was not touched in this package of sanctions. And furthermore, Lithuanian side directly opposed initiative of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to impose sanctions on Belarus Kali, producer of potash fertilizer, because it's a trade partner, important one for Klaipėda port. While Latvian side was not very keen to include in the EU sanctioning list Alexander Oleksin, regime-affiliated oligarch, right? Because he owns businesses in Latvia and employs people. So the question comes out of this: can we really say that Latvia and Lithuania pursued values-based foreign policy, or it was rather an illusion with still economic experience somewhere kept in mind? So Ramonas, maybe you could continue.
Thank you, Evie. Good question, and this is a traditional question, and I think the answer depends on what is the baseline for comparison. If we compare reactions of Baltic states with some other EU member states, as we already discussed, they went quite far and quite fast. Actually, some sanctions included also economic entities such as Spa in Druskininkai, a small resort town which is very popular among people, citizens of Belarus, including actually officials, part of the ruling elite. So I think it would not be totally correct to say that there were no economic transactions affected, and it is not without the reason that Alexander Lukashenko was publicly threatening a number of times in September, October last year to close the border with Lithuania entirely, to close the border with Poland, to redirect all transit from Klaipėda to other ports. So I think if we compare with other EU member states, as I said, the response went quite far. But if we compare with ideal standards, of course, what we have now is a sort of compromise. Compromise which excludes state-owned, targeting state-owned enterprises of Belarus, which of course would have immediate negative economic and financial effects on budget of Belarus. It would also have effects on Lithuanian economy if Lithuania alone went ahead with such sanctions. And the position of Lithuanian government is that it would support such sanctions if there was a common position of all EU member states. And in a sense, I can understand this, because otherwise Minsk can play off Lithuania against other EU member states, you know, by, for example, redirecting transit through Latvian ports or some other ports. Of course, he is working with Russia but there are limits how much Alexander Lukashenko can further increase his dependence on Russia. So I think, therefore, some of his talk was just threatening, but not responding to Baltic states' measures. But I do agree that what we have is a compromise, which leaves space for further actions if there is no improvement in Minsk.
Okay, thank you, Ramona. So you called the approach compromise. Andres, how would you call? And maybe continuing, Lithuania would join and go ahead with sanctioning also state enterprises if others would join. So how do you see, would Latvia agree on such further steps?
Obviously, on sanctions, we're ready to continue to work, and I can go into details on this, but I think it's very wrong to put the emphasis on sanctions as such. I think sanctions as such are not policy. I think if we go back to the autumn and the EU reaction, I think the most important reaction was to support civil society of Belarus, and to earmark EU money to stop, first of all, to stop financial flow to the regime, and to earmark these monies to support civic society. I think that is the most important step and the most important direction where EU needs to work in the future. Speaking on sanctions, there are limits what sanctions can do, and I would be skeptical that sanctions can change Lukashenko's policy. They didn't change his policies in the previous rounds of sanctions. As long as he receives support from Russia, he will always have a chance to survive. Whatever we do, we can apply economic sanctions. We can sanction businessmen. We can sanction oligarchs. We can go even further and adapt something like we do have right now against Russia for Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. We can apply sectorial sanctions against certain areas of Belarusian economy, like fertilizer companies, against the oil production companies. The question is that we need to keep in mind what we will achieve with this. How big is the risk that we're gonna push Belarus as a country deeper into Russian hands? How big is the risk that we gonna damage the economic situation of normal, regular people on Belarusian streets? I would be happy also to hear Franek's opinion on this, because I think countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland will survive. We are part of the bigger organization. That the transit is not so huge. The transit in overall transit that we have, transit from Belarus accounts to about 25% from all the transit that goes through Latvia is transit related from Belarus. From all the cargoes that we receive is also about like 30%. It's important, but it's not huge, and our country will not go down because of this. But we have to, I think we have to look also geopolitically at what we want to achieve and what we can achieve.
Andres, I will, sorry for interruption, I will stop you here. Indeed, we will ask maybe afterwards Franek how he sees from his perspective if economic sanctions would help or they would rather harm. And geopolitical implications we will discuss a bit later. But for now, thank you. Let's proceed also with others in the first round of question, and then let's elaborate a bit more. So Hans, it's time for you to assess from the perspective of Sweden, of the Nordic countries, and Europe at large, what have been done initially. Hans, I think you have turned off your camera. You're back. Great. So please.
Well, thank you. Let me answer this question in different capacities. First, as a Swede, I must say that from a Swedish perspective, Belarus is quite far away, especially if you compare it with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We have other historical and also economically and emotional ties with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania than we have with Belarus. So for the Swedish public, what's happening now in Belarus is very much media driven. So when we see things in media, you have the coverings, you have the photos, you have reports about this, what's happening in the jails, the rapings, then Swedes want to see some reaction. And one good example of that is you mentioned the ice hockey game. As you probably know, Sweden is a very good ice hockey nation, so we really look forward to this game. But it's not a political decision, it's made by the Ice Hockey Federation. But during this media covering what's happening in Belarus, it was a huge pressure on the Swedish Ice Hockey Federation not to have the game in Belarus. And for example, we had also this kind of contact from my party with the Ice Hockey Federation to say that Swedes don't like the idea of playing ice hockey in Belarus. Secondly, in the other capacity, I represent the main opposition party in Sweden, the Moderate Party, and I'm also deputy chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. And I would say that inside the parliament, it has been more a political decision between government and opposition. And it's also important to add another fact to that, and that is also that the current government, the Social Democratic and Green Party government, are chairing the OSCE this year. So our foreign minister is the chairman of the security organization OSCE, and therefore I think that she's also trying to meddling also in this. And this opened a window for us in the opposition also to have demands on the government. And I would say that the opposition in Sweden, the center right-wing parties, we have 4 center right-wing parties, have pressured the government to do more, for example, on sanctions. Sweden has not the laws that that we have the same ability as I understand that the 3 Baltic states has, though that we have no national Magnitsky law. And therefore we work with sanctions not as a single country, but inside the whole European family, so together with all the other in the European Union. So it has been that we have made from the opposition pressure on the government, and the government have well, in those kind of discussions inside the EU, also pressured for sanctions. As a pro-European, I think it was sad that it took too long time for the European Union to have sanction and to show that something happened. And we also know that it was blocked for different reasons by some countries inside the European Union. But you need to have all the countries behind you. And therefore, I think that for today, it's 84 individuals on the sanction list, and I think it's 7 different companies. Thirdly, in my third capacity, and you mentioned I was the former president of the Nordic Council. I'm also chairman of the 3rd biggest party group inside the Nordic Council, the Conservative Group. And I would say that as in the Nordic Council, we have had lots of exchange with especially the Baltic friends about what's happening in Belarus, because I would say that especially Lithuania is very much our ears and eyes to what's happening in Belarus. But we have also had meetings between the Nordic Council and Svetlana Tishanovskaya and others. The Conservative group has also a very good and special relation with our sister party Lithuania and also with the new former Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis. And I would also say that the former Minister of Foreign Affairs Linas Linkevich is also quite popular in Sweden, has good contacts both with the opposition and with the current government. So what I'm saying, to boiling down, is that for us in Sweden, the Baltic states are very much front runners for us, and I would say especially Lithuania. So we have good contacts with our colleagues in Lithuania, the government to the government, but also opposition to the opposition. Well, not opposition, but opposition to Gabrielius Landsbergis. So for us, it's very important to have that, but also to say, and this is important, from a Swedish and a Nordic perspective, Belarus is quite far away. We had a very good ambassador in Belarus, in Stefan Eriksson, and I would say that Belarus has also, the people of Belarus and the culture of Belarus had a very good ambassador in Sweden, in Stefan Eriksson also. But it's, you need that kind of voices in Sweden, as Stefan Eriksson is. So this is my picture of the Swedish and Nordic relations vis-à-vis Belarus.
Okay, thank you, Hans. So it seems that there are some also domestic constraints or domestic issues that move either ahead or block the sanctioning things in Sweden and probably in other Nordic countries. Well, I had, could you please maybe very briefly, very shortly comment, yes, you're right, indeed, Sweden and the Nordic countries are more distant from Belarus, but on the other hand, it is advantage to the extent if you would like to align with the Baltic countries in at least in symbolic sanctioning, then you would have basically nothing to lose, right? In the Baltic countries, we had to think twice due to the economic interdependence, but in case of the Nordic countries, as you don't have that many bilateral interactions, well, you could probably freely join the alliance of the Baltic countries and create such a regional bubble of symbolic sanctions. So why didn't the Nordic countries do that so far?
Well, firstly, I think, well, at least when it comes to Sweden, we don't have that legal structure that we do that. We do sanctions inside international organizations such as United Nations or the European Union. So we don't do that solitarily. We don't do it by ourselves. Not even with 2 or 3 other countries. But saying that, what the Baltic states have done have been an argument for especially the opposition to press the current government to do things inside the European Union. But you're perfectly right. Sweden and the other Nordic countries has a very low price to pay to do these kind of sanctions. But also to mention, we use this kind of sanction regime quite seldom, and as I said, we do it always inside international bodies such as the European Union and United Nations.
Okay, thank you. So you have chosen a different approach, let me put it that way. Finally, we have got to Franak as well, and Franak, the same question actually goes to you, but let me put it a bit different. So I'm sure that right after the crisis in Belarus erupted, you had some, Belarusians and also the Coordination Council probably had some expectations in respect to the potential responses and level of engagement of international society, and including the neighboring countries and also neighboring regions. So could you please comment to what extent those expectations have materialized so far?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me and hosting such a discussion. I must say that we didn't expect such response neither from Nordic nor Baltic countries. It's spectacular, and we were really impressed and shocked. The first country Svetlana went from Belarus was Lithuania. The first leaders she has met were Scandinavian leaders. Almost all the leaders of all Scandinavian, Nordic and Baltic states have met Svetlana Tikhanovskaya team and herself. And I'm really impressed how strong this response and quick this response was. I must say that this first goal, legitimization of new majority of Belarusians and delegitimization of corrupted government, it was fulfilled to 100%. And first of all, thanks to this quick and important response. Right now, we have built ties with governments of the countries. And after first initial symbolic meetings with Svetlana, we already developed the strategy of work with each of discussed countries. For example, with Sweden, we work directly on the OSCE track. And it seems that we are lucky to have such troika at OSCE, Albania, Poland, Sweden, which all of these countries are very involved in the Belarus situation. And Sweden, not just involved, but they know how to deal with it because they have experience of many years of supporting Belarus. And Sweden also gives example to the entire Europe how Belarus can be bipartisan, multi-partisan policy, because I think in Sweden there is no division in terms of approaching Belarus. And I think many other European countries has the same, and I think we have to stick with this policy and to make that Belarus is unifying countries, parties, different forces, and that Belarus is success story. And what I wanted to pass again and repeat again, that Belarus can be success story of Europe, of Nordic countries, of Baltic countries as well. We are very close to the victory, but since we chose this peaceful, non-violent form of resistance, we can't finish, we can't prevail without support from outside. It's always, dilemma. Of course, there are many Belarusians who call for resistance, and they're ready for more aggressive resistance to the occupation, which really happened to Belarus. But we are trying to keep this nonviolent discipline, culture, and I think this is why we have such support also among Baltic Nordic countries, and this is why we also expect a bigger involvement. And this is why we repeat about sanctions. I will come back to sanctions question. So when Sweden is about OSCE, Estonia helped us a lot with United Nations Security Council. Both meetings were huge thing for Belarus and for our cause. And we found out at these meetings who are our allies and who are not yet allies. Finland, for example, during last meeting with Finnish ministry and government, we found out that Finland is good to build ties with OSCE, through OSCE, but also in arranging discussions on dialogue and negotiations we are pushing forward right now. And now about challenges. We don't have much tools, as someone has mentioned here. Belarus is very dependent on Russia, 50% of trade. The second is Ukraine, and the whole trade with the European Union is about 20%. And also there is no much economic connection, political, diplomatic connection. So we have very limited leverage, but we still can use it. What we can discuss, how to increase efficiency of sanctions and how to increase efficiency of assistance. And this is where we have enough space. Regarding assistance, I will start with the easier thing. The problem is that this assistance that is provided or promised by different governments, it still doesn't reach people on the ground. Unfortunately not. I think authorities made sure that all these funds, support for media, journalists, activists, are staying somewhere in the bureaucratic mechanisms. It's very difficult to bring funds to Belarus. Many people cannot pay their fines, their homes are confiscated, their cars are confiscated. So basically the support supposed to help Belarusians is not felt yet there. And what we have to think how to change the way we work with Belarus. Non-conventional situation needs a non-conventional solution. To illustrate, EU support for small medium enterprise goes through the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, but unfortunately, companies repressed or closed by government cannot apply for this help. Only those who have registration in Belarus, license to work, can expect this support. And this is the problem of bureaucracy, of rules, of standards. Support this aid supposed to help repressed businesses, but in fact suppressed businesses are eliminated from this. And this is about other spheres as well. We have to think together, to brainstorm separately how to make assistance efficiently and how to prioritize. Right now we see the huge attack on media, both new emerging media and traditional media, on journalists, on human rights defenders, on lawyers, of course on students. And I think we have to shape this assistance in the way to help the most vulnerable group. And the sanctions, the most difficult topic. Why they need? Can I have 1 minute?
Franak, my point was that we will come back to the what can we do, so basically also the sanctioning topic in the next question. So if I may, I will interrupt you here, so let's say start a new round and then you can express yourself further on sanctions and next steps to be taken. So indeed, you just mentioned that this is a quotation that we are close to victory. But well, looking from our perspective, it seems that during those 7 months, well, practically nothing much has changed in Belarus, actually. So Lukashenko is where he is, and he has become even more cautious. Indeed, as you already mentioned, so there are journalists behind bars. People are being detained even before the riots, right? And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has been just accused of terrorism. So it seems that current strategies or so far implemented steps, they do not really work, and some new ideas should be brought. And this is what we are going to talk about now. And well, on the other hand, I'm happy and I'm glad that actually in recent weeks, Belarus has become an issue for international community again, right? It was forgotten for some period during the winter while protests didn't take place, but now it's on the agenda again. And but it seems that this collective international focus, it has shifted to collecting evidence of violence, to the direction which works with actually implications of the crisis, the effects of crisis. This is good and it's necessary, of course, but we're not really talking about the root causes. From my perspective, it looks like prescribing, painkillers for treatment of cancer, right? We're doing something, but probably not with a cancer, but with effects, so it's relevant to ask what could we do differently, or what could we do more individually as a Baltic states and Nordic states, and maybe together in order to help achieve some tangible effects on the regime, right, on the root cause. And maybe how Nordic Baltic platform could be used more effectively in this regard. So maybe we could think of new strategies, and let me start with Hans, as he probably will have to leave earlier. So Hans, how do you see? Indeed, Sweden is presiding country in the OSCE. So, but we are again talking about the effects. But what could we do with the root cause of the problem, and maybe how could we use Nordic-Baltic cooperation more efficiently?
Well, the problem is that Lukashenko is a dictator, and he's supported by Russia. So you have, unfortunately, lots of similarities to see between Venezuela and Belarus. So the time is the best ally for the dictator. So I think it's important that we create and uphold this pressure, the political pressure on Lukashenko, on Belarus, but we must also, unfortunately understand that his power is also guaranteed by Russia. And we have one more dimension, which we have not mentioned yet, but it's also the security and the defense dimension, because this is a thing that we talk quite a lot about. And I had a NATO meeting. Well, we are not NATO members yet, but I had a meeting with Brussels earlier today, and this is something that they have on the monitors, the defense and security dimension of what's happening in Belarus. And at the same time, we hear this kind of potential noise also from Ukraine with a new threat from Russia, not only Russia's war in eastern Ukraine, but maybe new and bigger battles and struggles. So, I think that the best thing is to have this international pressure, and at the same time, as Franak mentioned, from a Swedish perspective, also try to use OSSE as a meddler. And one of the demands that we have from the Swedish opposition on the Swedish government to press inside the OSCE is to try to have new, fair and democratic election, hopefully this year. But it's hard to see if it's going to be so. But we try to have the pressure, and others need to also have pressure, so we can have the kind of international, monitoring what's happening in Belarus.
Okay, thank you. What I heard was about pressure, right? Andres, maybe you could follow up. How can we create this pressure more effectively, right? We're talking about pressure, about elections. Yes, indeed, we need it, but how to reach it?
Obviously, it's as someone in the beginning said, there is no sole solution for this. I think we have to apply both pressures, psychological pressure that we have done already right now from the EU. I think I come back to my first point. I think it's important. Our main effort should be directed towards supporting the civic society, supporting people like those who are pushed out of the Belarus with intention from Lukashenko's side to marginalize them. So I think EU needs to add more money. These 30 million are not enough. When we need to find ways, as Franek said, to find the ways of more efficient ways how to provide this assistance to civil society. I think we need to think about people-to-people contacts. I think our strategy should be long-term strategy. There will be no quick fixes, as I agree with concept. Neither Lukashenko nor Russia will be interested in fast and democratic processes. So this is one point on support to civic society and people-to-people contacts. Secondly, obviously we have to continue with sanctions. Obviously, I think in autumn EU as such was not prepared. We have not had, to invent smart sanctions that doesn't hurt you, but hurts your opponent. It takes months to prepare. So I think there is room. I will just mention one. We should think about sectorial sanctions that will hurt Belarus regime more than EU. And one way, for example, is to restrict investment. Like we restricted EU investment and US investment in critical sectors in Russia, in oil and gas exploration areas, and limited financial flows to Russian banks. The same could be done also in Belarus. This will not immediately hurt EU economies, but it will increase pressure on Belarusian economy and Lukashenko's economy, on his money-producing sectors in the future. So why don't we, agree to forbid EU investment, for example, in potash sector, in oil refineries, in agriculture sectors, future investments, future money. This will be a strong signal to Lukashenko, but will not hurt immediately EU. I will not say everything, because obviously we are listened also by Belarusian KGB right now. And I just say that, they have to understand that we are working and we are preparing, and that our economic ties will not be the factor. Thank you.
Ramonas, yes? Ramonas, what would be your suggestions for next step, and maybe still a bit about Nordic-Baltic cooperation enhancement?
Thank you. I would say that more of the same probably is most feasible and most likely scenario, because there isn't much more that the EU or Baltic states together with Nordic states can do. Just I know that the saying more of the same usually has negative connotations, but in this case I see positive meaning in terms of maintaining attention, political attention of the whole European Union to the situation in Belarus, because indeed for autocracies, for ruling elites in such regimes as Belarus, time is usually a very important factor, because time means opposition activists get tired. They simply experience too much suffering, psychological, material, and other types of suffering. So I think, those priorities of supporting democratic activists and also having in mind additional sanctions which would spill over into particular sectors, as Andrzej's mentioned, I think are most likely and probably the only directions. And here I think Baltic states could continue taking the lead, and I think Nordic countries could further support them, maybe even more support them inside forums such as the EU, OSCE, UN, and others, because that's how common action, common decisions and actions are taken. So that would be my answer. And I would also note that we should be realistic in our expectations, so that we are not disappointed too quickly. And what I mean is that any authoritarian regime is not easy to change. Even in cases where ruling political elites are supporting political and institutional reforms, I have in mind Georgia, Ukraine, we see immense difficulties in implementing those reforms. In Ukraine, especially in the economic area, where oligarchic influences are still very strong, and most reforms are half implemented only. So, and EU's influence is also limited usually abroad, especially when it does not offer membership perspective. So we should have this in mind, so that we don't get disappointed too fast ourselves as well. So I would say more of the same in the future, and the most important thing is to be the ones who maintain European Union's political attention to the situation in Belarus.
Thank you, Ramonas. Well, not much of enthusiasm was in the previous two answers. So, Franek, how does it look from your perspective, what our colleagues just offered? Is it enough? Is it sufficient? And before you answer, let me quote Svetlana Tikhanovskaya on Twitter, and then you can elaborate also, that as she writes, OSCE and UN are ready to organize a platform as mediator, as well as to force the regime to negotiate. This is a response to the initiative, right, which is now ongoing, that changes will be implemented or will be reached through the mediated dialogue. And those two platforms indeed were agreed, but what about forcing? How does it sound to you what our colleagues said before? If it's enough for forcing the regime, if such steps and continuing as now we're doing, if it would be enough for forcing regime to negotiate, at least to talk?
I think we don't use the all opportunities and the resources we have. And I think international organizations and community can do much more, but it's an issue of political will, of course, priorities second, and media attention. Because the politics today is media driven, and we see that after we changed the formats of the rallies in order to save people's lives, to more decentralized, to smaller marches, the attention to Belarus decreased, and the speed of support of doing things for Belarus decreased significantly, many times. And we want to change this policy from image-driven to values-driven, because this media image-driven policy towards Belarus, it doesn't lead to real results, because we see that Belarusians still support the changes. We see how system is rotten from inside. I disagree that we don't see significant changes in Belarus. You know, people, former high officials are calling us. It was impossible to imagine in August last year. They are sharing information, they are leaking videos. Unfortunately, many of them arrested already. Today we knew that 2 guys who were leaking videos, they got 20 years in jail for treason. And it is not a sign of stability that system is strengthening. More and more followers of those who want changes and risk with their lives, basically, people emerge. There are hundreds of those who are in the system and helping the changes, and more of them are joining. So that's the first sign. Second, I would propose to use the formula EAP, we call it, like Eastern Partnership or European Action Plan. Elections, accountability, and partnerships. Elections is priority number 1. If we all will be speaking in one voice, that elections must take place this year, and repeat, elections. Not constitutional reforms, not talking to Lukashenko, not talking to Russia, but elections. This is a very fair demand. It will help us a lot to not lose focus. We are losing focus because we are trying, perhaps we have to wait, perhaps it's a long game, perhaps the situation will not change this year. And this is why policy becomes inefficient. If states, Canada, Nordic countries, Baltic states will be repeating about elections this year, and we will be materializing these elections with practical actions, with pressure by big players, by EU and US, that will help us a lot. Sanctions work. After US announced the lifting sanctions, not lifting, but the prolongation of sanctions towards 9 companies, it was huge effect. We get so much information, calls, there was such internal dynamic in the government. They are really afraid. They made contracts, they are making now contracts to not write the name of the company, to avoid sanctions. And we don't have signs that it pushes to Russia. Lukashenko's economy is very dependent on Russia. It can use temporarily, in some situations, Russian ports, seaports, Russian channels of trade, etc., but it can't solve the problem entirely. Yes, they can trade, they can sell some potash to India, but it will not guarantee that Belarus Kali will survive. So I would recommend to consider the sanctions policy, but to synchronize this policy with all other players. especially with the United States. It's very important because their sanctions right now, their sanction regime is the most powerful. EU sanctions are important, but the regime itself, it doesn't limit from, it's very easy to avoid European sanctions. Unfortunately, the companies sanctions in 2011, 12, 13 by EU, they managed to avoid, and this is why we tell right now, oh, sanctions towards Belarus didn't work. It's not true. They work, but they have to be implemented in a different way. And if I may, regarding the optimism and the timeline, I remember such discussion in July and August with experts, with politicians, stakeholders. No one said there will be change this year, there will be protest or whatever. It's a long game, we have to wait, transform Belarus system, engage Lukashenko's government. But everything changed in August, September, October. Everything was absolutely shocking. No one predicted. In the time of digital technologies, having our capacity, having the absolutely new quality of Belarus society, changes might happen very quickly. Trigger can happen any day. Lukashenko makes so many mistakes. He makes so many statements, so many weird appointments. So he can actually lead to this following protest. The problem is, will we be ready for another critical moment? Will we as Belarusians, and if international community will be ready to provide Belarusians to sustain their protest and to help Belarusians to achieve what they want, and they want elections. This is the question. And in order to have it, we should, of course, be ready for long game, but prepare for quick actions. More longer we wait, lesser chance for peaceful transition we will get.
Thank you, Franek. And from what we have heard just now, it seems that the further strategy should include two elements. One of it's a positive thinking about elections, right? So if we will think, then there will be elections. And still, in contrary to what some of our colleagues mentioned or said, sanctions could work or could help, at least from the perspective of Belarus. And actually, we're slowly running out of time, but let's let us discuss the very final question, and let's extend our debate a bit to the geopolitical aspect and geopolitical platform. And as already mentioned by I guess all of you, Russia is a key factor in success of Belarusians in coming months or maybe years. So do you have any idea from the perspective of, probably from the European perspective, rather from Nordic-Baltic perspective, how to achieve Russia's non-interference? Are there any mechanisms how Russia's non-interference in issues of Belarus can be achieved? So meaning, how can we stop Russia's support to existing regime? And do we have sort of collective will to potentially confront interests of Russia over Belarus? And if we put it even in more different words, can we say that Belarus is important enough for the Western community to engage deeper in this crisis and potentially confront Russia? And maybe also you could briefly give your assessments or give your comments also to the audience question, which is kind of related, and audience is asking, so what red lines has Putin crossed in Russia's response to unrest in Belarus, and what will be the result of such approach? So two questions combined. If we can prevent Russia of intervening, and what will be results of Russia's support to the regime. Maybe Franek, now do you have anything to say about this geopolitical perspective?
I have to be very cautious about geopolitical perspective because we are not, we do not make geopolitical prize. And I can just say that Lukashenko is becoming very expensive for Russia, and the sanctions actually, they do not help Russia much. Opposite, they make Lukashenko costly. Russia uses Belarus economy and Lukashenko as well. So I think it will not be supporting Lukashenko for a long time. They also are looking for for the solution, for other forces, for other people to support. But we repeatedly say that it's not about choosing between Russia and Europe. It's about giving elections, and if there will be pro-Russian party, they will compete in free democratic election. But let Belarus go, and Belarusians to decide. But we see the same with China. You know, just compare how China was supportive towards Lukashenko in August, September, but now they didn't provide any loans or any development project. They didn't propose any investment development project in last half year to Belarus. So they are cooling off, and this is the moment, you know, to propose another scenario, the roadmap, to explain the advantages of such dialogue, what can be discussed. This is why we ask OSCE and Swedish chairmanship also to involve Russia as mediator, to make sure that Russia will not be blocking these agreements or decisions. So we are trying to be very cautious in this. Russia is our important neighbor, a neighbor forever, and we have to include it in the process, but reminding that do not interfere, because right now it sounds like Russia says that Tikhanovskaya don't interfere in Belarus affairs, and this is not correct.
Okay, Andrzej, maybe you could proceed. Do you see perspectives how elections could be held in Belarus without sort of engagement of Russia, direct or indirect, with its own candidate, with its own party, or any other scenario? So, Andrzej.
Well, obviously, Russia will want to manage the processes. You know, be it Lukashenko or somebody else, Russia will want to manage these transition processes. And I think our duty from the West, from the transatlantic community, is to remind them that stability, long-term stability in Belarus is not achievable if political process is not involving all political parties, all political players. You know, it's impossible to create a stability if you don't engage people who have been pushed out of the Belarus. So I think, you know, I think Russians understand this. My feeling is that they have to understand this, and the question is only when they will be able to proceed to something that will lead to a more homogeneous and integrated society. If not, you know, all the projects where Russia has tried to impose political processes outside Russia, they have failed at some moment. So, so I think, you know, at the moment when Russia will realize that supporting Lukashenko or managing the processes in Belarus is risking to lose sympathies of Belarusian people, that's going to be the changing moment.
Okay, thank you. So it's kind of proposal just to wait. And Ramonas, what about you?
Well, I think from the very start of the events last summer, the biggest challenge for democratic activists in Belarus is that despite their wish to simply have domestic agenda which focuses on free and fair elections, and this proposal was actually raised by Lithuanian president and other institutions from the very beginning of this crisis. I mean, this is a consistent Lithuania's position as well, that first of all, the fair and free elections should be organized, and then whoever wins them will be taking the legitimate decisions. But the biggest challenge is that this wish to focus only on domestic issues without touching on geopolitics is unrealistic. Such a change has clear geopolitical implications, at least as seen from the side of Russian authorities. In Moscow, I think the understanding of regime change, and I mean introduction of free and fair elections, leads to regime change, at least politically. is seen as something that might be repeated in Russia soon, and might threaten a ruling regime in Moscow. So, and that's just one though very important reason why it's impossible not to speak about geopolitics. And I think this is the biggest challenge, maybe even the biggest tragedy of democratic movement in Belarus. There was no such a case where autocratic regime would be supporting democratic reforms in its neighborhood. When we speak about post-Soviet area, I think early 90s was a very short-lived exception, unfortunately, when Moscow, but it was more or less democratic, Moscow was supporting reforms in neighboring countries. So I think this is unfortunately the main dilemma, and Russia has been and continues to interfere. EU cannot do much, just be more consistent in terms of, well, its position that it's up to people in Belarus to decide how they want to live. I mean, that's the main, should be the main element of EU's position. It could be, of course, more straightforward when talking with Moscow about that, because, well, at least half a year ago, some people in the EU were acting clearly not to upset Moscow, but at the same time, it was quite clear that their restraint was not reciprocated in Moscow. I mean, the restraint of EU has really no effects on policies of Russia towards Belarus. So it is, I think, the main challenge, and I don't see an easy way out of this unless something changes the calculus of ruling authorities in Moscow. But I can't really see what could that be.
Thank you, Ramonas, thank you, Andrzejs, and thank you, Fronek. I think at this point we may finish our today's event. And all in all, I think we had quite interesting talk, discussion, and we even managed to come up with some concrete suggestions for future steps. And let me list at least some of them. So as we heard, suspension of foreign investments in Belarus could be proposed. Then economic sanctions might help as well, and of course we should continue supporting the civil society in Belarus and society in general. But of course it's also clear that the resolution of crisis is in the hands of Belarusians themselves, and they will still have to figure out how to deal with their own dilemmas. What I mean with this is that on the one hand they have to either continue popular protests, risking being detained or even imprisoned, but with hope that this would really change the regime at some point, bring expected changes, or they can stay at home. Yes, situation is quite complicated now. But on that side, being on the safe side, well, it means that the regime could last even longer. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me today. And of course, thank you very much for watching us online. And goodbye, and Živie Belarus!